Hi, everybody. I think we're going to get started. Ikse. That Inkri, that means that's it. Stop talking now. Sorry, that's kind of rude. Yeah. Danse Nawaku Manag. Hello, all my relations from Turtle Island. My name is Angel Aluk. I'm here to introduce Harsha Walia. It's a great honor to introduce her. Like many people here, I've studied anti-racism my whole graduate life and now in my career as a labor researcher, so I'm very honored to introduce her. Harsha Walia is a co-founder of the migrant justice group No One Is Illegal. She's also the author of Undoing Border Imperialism. In fact, she's sold out her books here at the conference, I believe. So she'll be taking names afterwards if you want a copy of her book. She's the project coordinator at the downtown Eastside Women's Center. And for the past 2 decades, she's been involved in grassroots community organizing. She's trained in law, and she's done numerous presentations on race, migration, detention, gender, and poverty to the United Nations and across campuses. Her talk today, as you know, is called Racism, Austerity and Precarity. As a feminist and anti-racist and labor scholar, I'm very honored to have her here. So let's welcome Harsha. Thank you.
Hello, how's everyone doing? Is it okay if is everyone on your between lunch, pre-dinner, sloth mode? Yeah, okay. I want to start by acknowledging that I and we are gathered here on a Treaty 6 territory, and I want to extend my gratitude and thanks and respect to nations here on these territories. And particularly in an era of Trump and escalating white supremacy and this contention in Canadian corporate media that somehow escalating white supremacy in Canada is a Trump import. I think it's important to remember that white supremacy is not a Trump import, and some of the first white supremacists on these territories were those who massacred and colonized these lands. And that white supremacy began with the doctrine of discovery, which decreed that any land not inhabited by Christians was open to European settlement. And because colonization is based on terra nullius, the myth of barren land, it's vital that we refuse to perpetuate terra nullius by always acknowledging the land that we're on and acting in accordance with Indigenous laws. And this is not just historic. We know that despite apologies for residential schools, today there are more children who are apprehended and placed into foster homes than ever were in residential schools. Despite the rhetoric of reconciliation and Trudeau's attempts to turn to innocence, on this 150th year of Confederation, over 150 Indigenous communities are living with water boil advisories. Somehow our political leaders can figure out how to drill and frack and mine in rural and northern communities, but cannot figure out how to get food onto the table of single mothers in Indigenous communities and cannot figure out how to build schools for kids in the north. And I say this rhetorically because they can't figure out how to do it. It's that this is actually the function of dispossession and deliberate impoverishment, that these are not coincidences, that extraction continues and exploitation continues while social well-being and welfare is completely ignored. And so contending with colonization as ongoing and not a relic of the past must always inform all of our work. I also want to thank the organizers for having me here, and all of Parkland's amazing staff and volunteers have done such a tremendous job in bringing us all together. So thank you again to Parkland. And I also want to thank Gail in particular. I don't know if she's here. But for all of her labor of arranging all of our, and the speakers in particular, travel and food and accommodation and more. And I offer this gratitude to Gail, not only as my personal gratitude, but also for me as political recognition of the gender division of labor that continues to operate within our homes to the shop floor. And across the political spectrum, the feminized processes of capitalism means that paid and unpaid work of women is the work that makes all work possible. And so I want to recognize, again, in our convening today, the work that Gail, and I imagine so many other women and volunteers that I see that are women here in our space, and to thank them again for this work. I also want to thank Parkland for taking the risk of inviting me here, knowing I'm probably your wildcard speaker. And I probably won't disappoint in that regard, because I've changed my talk up a bit. And that's because I want to offer some provocations and addendums to the conversations, the many thoughtful and really brilliant conversations that have been happening in this conference today. And particularly, I want us to think more deeply about neoliberalism's necessary entanglement with racial violence. And so what I'm going to talk about today is specifically looking at the nexus between neoliberalism and racial violence. So I'm going to take up three primary things. The first thing I want to take up is this is not going to be a funny talk. So I'm going to disappoint in that regard. But I want to first take up the prevailing kind of leftist articulation of neoliberalism, and that particularly that neoliberalism shrinks government, right? So, which is to say that we know that neoliberalism is an economic and political regime that prioritizes market forces to bring in austerity, tax cuts, deregulation, cuts to social spending, privatization, and all of that, right? That, of course, is all true. But I think what's missing in debates when we talk about big and small government is that it leaves unquestioned the role of the state in our political, economic, and social life, especially when it comes to racialized communities. And here's the particular thing about neoliberalism in Canada in the past 2 decades. It's that public spending has increased in certain areas of our lives. And that is the truth about neoliberalism. Neoliberalism does not always and inherently mean a cut to public spending. And in fact, I want to offer you 3 examples of increases in public spending in Canada between the range of the past 20 years, within the range of the past 20 years. So the first is looking forward, which is that this summer, as people know, Trudeau announced that Canada will increase its military and defense budget by 73% over the next decade. The second example is that between 2002 and 2012, prison spending nationally rose by 23%. The third, which is the most stark and shocking, is that police budgets have on average doubled over the past 20 years, and in some Canadian municipalities, half of a city's entire operating budget is spent on policing. So, in particular, these last two, the increases in prison and policing budgets, are happening despite, as we know, falling crime rates. And also important to note is that the total incarcerated population of white people is actually decreasing by approximately 10% in prisons, which is a good thing. We don't really want people in prisons, particularly for poverty-related crimes. But the number of Indigenous women and Black Canadians in prison has increased by 70% over the past decade, right? And every single year, the United Nations Special Rapporteur, every single year, the investigator at Corrections Canada, every single year, human rights rapporteurs talk about this as one of the greatest epidemics in Canada right now, right? So we often look at incarceration as an American issue without looking at the growing incarceration in Canada that still is largely controlled by the public sphere, right? So while we have an entry of the private sector into the prison system, it's largely still regulated through the public sphere. So what I want to offer then as my first contention is that neoliberalism is not inherently an enemy of public spending per se, but that more precisely, neoliberalism increases the power of governments to determine its priorities based on existing stratifications and strategies of both racist and class-based state control. This is really crucial to understand if we truly want to build an inclusive analysis and movement. Big government is not just the boogeyman of the right. It's also a legitimate fear of Indigenous, Black, Muslim, refugee, racialized, and low-income communities. Remember that Indigenous peoples are not only suing multinational giants, but also going up against public crown corporations for violating their inherent and internationally protected right to free, prior, and informed consent. There are currently 22 proposed hydro projects in Canada, and every single one, including Labrador's Muskrat Falls, British Columbia's Site C, Manitoba's Kiask, and Quebec's La Romaine project, are all within 50 to 100 kilometers of Indigenous communities. Remember that while in the mainstream, Muslim has become synonymous with terrorism, men who terrorize Indigenous women walk free, as less than 5% of perpetrators against Indigenous women are even charged. And when they are charged, they're often found not guilty, such as in the horrific murder of Cindy Gladue, who was found dead here in Edmonton in a bathtub. And even though he confessed to harming her, as we know, Bradley Barton was found not guilty of first-degree murder, which is now being appealed, but only despite tremendous outrage across this country. Remember that while successive governments have debated laws criminalizing the niqab and are spying in mosques and in schools, reported hate crimes against Muslims have increased 253% over 4 years in this country. Remember that while over 100 legislative changes spanning immigration to charitable tax donations have been brought in the past decade to combat alleged Islamic terrorism in Canada, Canada's own radical spy agency, CSIS, actually lists white supremacists as Canada's #1 domestic threat. There are at least 110 white supremacist groups operating in Canada overground, which is not to say the ones that are not operating overground, and who under the faulty guise of free speech are rallying in every city across this country and are amassing supporters across this country, and not a single legislative change has been tabled to counter their racist violence. Remember that between the years of 2000 and 2005, when Canada's economy grew by 13% and white Canadian workers' earnings grew very marginally and modestly, but did grow by 3%, the average income of racialized Canadian workers in that same period actually declined by 1%. So I offer these all up because the late, great Eduardo Galeano says, indignation must always be the answer to indignity, and reality is not destiny. And so I want to repeat here again that we cannot fight against neoliberalism without an understanding of how race and racism underwrites all of our social, political, and economic spheres. Within weeks of 9/11, Steve Logan, a chief executive of one of the world's largest prison companies, GEO Group, the notorious GEO Group, told stock analysts, it's clear that since September 11th, there's a heightened focus on detention, both on the borders and in the US. What we are seeing is an increased scrutiny of tightening up the borders. More people are going to get caught. Can anyone guess what this fucker said about this? I think this is positive. This is going to be an increased share for our shareholders. End quote. So the war on terror, which has brought, decades, almost 2 decades now, of organized terror in the form of NATO imperialism abroad and mass surveillance at home, has maximized profitability for security markets. The value of Israeli state exports in security technologies alone has quadrupled. Neoliberalism is thus completely and deeply connected to the increasingly militarized, policed, and securitized state that we are all living under, but under different conditions. And in Alberta, thank you. One person's enjoying this talk. And I think in Alberta, you all understand this deeply in relationship to the tar sands, right? Over half of Alberta's tar sands goes to the United States. And in the United States, the Department of Defense is the world's larger buyer and consumer of oil. And I think, unfortunately, what environmentalists have completely failed to articulate is that we're not going to have a green transition. We're not going to be able to have a renewable energy revolution or any of that until we completely dismantle the imperialist military-industrial complex that is subjugating, occupying, and killing brown and black people across the world. So we cannot talk about keeping it on the ground. We cannot talk about renewable energy until we talk about the connections between neoliberalism and the oil industry and the fossil fuel industry and war and imperialism, right? Which is completely embedded in a racist project of civilization. French philosopher Etienne Balibar reminds us that we must critically question what the state is tending to become, how it is behaving, and what functions it is fulfilling. So I would argue that the state is the political and legal jurisdiction that continues to allow for the expansion of transnational neoliberalism while maintaining hierarchies across race. And one of the ways in which this is most obvious is in the case of migrant workers, which is the second issue that I want to turn to. Canada's Temporary Foreign Worker Program, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, is what migrant worker Noe Ortega calls modern-day slavery. And what I want to talk about before jumping into migrant worker programs specifically is to let people know, if you don't already know, is that Canada currently accepts more migrants on temporary work visas and under temporary permits than those who can immigrate permanently. And this decrease in permanent immigration, this quintessential Canadian myth that we are a nation of immigrants, that people, have the right to permanent residency, all of this explosion of temporary migration and the simultaneous decrease in permanent residency is also not a coincidence. It is not a reflection of a broken immigration system. It is not a relic of the Harper era. It's actually been in place quite deliberately for at least 20 years, first brought in by the previous Liberal government. And so just by way of backdrop about, so what's happening in terms of the decrease in permanent residency. So I'll just talk about that in brief before moving on to specifically the migrant worker program. And this is, we see this in the news, right? We see a lot of shit in the news about Trudeau hugging babies. For the past 2 years, the front page of major newspapers is all about Trudeau hugging, particularly refugee babies, I should say, how he's at the airport welcoming refugees, giving people Canadian flags, and proclaiming refugees welcome, right? Saying, we welcome refugees. But what isn't as reported on, and of course, this is because it's part of the Trudeau brand, is a number of things. One is that every single Syrian refugee in Ottawa, for example, is currently using the food bank, right? So what are the limitations of this supposed welcome, right? What are the ways in which poverty and neoliberalism is being inscribed onto the lives of refugees that we're supposedly welcoming? The second is also this starker reality of what's been happening this summer, particularly in Quebec, which is that in 1 month alone, the RCMP intercepted is a really legally kind word of not saying detained and arrested, but the RCMP have basically detained and arrested 3,000 people, 3,000 refugees, primarily of Haitian descent, who are coming across the US-Canada border in 1 month alone, in July. 3,000 were detained and arrested. And thousands of them are still living in military tents near the US-Canada border. And what the Canadian media didn't report on, if they reported on this at all, is that the reporting was focused on how Donald Trump had removed temporary protected status for Haitian refugees. Did people hear about this? Donald Trump removing TPS status? What wasn't reported on was that actually Justin Trudeau had removed a moratorium on deportations to Haiti a whole year prior than Donald Trump had. And in all of the administrative paperwork that you go back and you look at Donald Trump assessing the situation of TPS, he points to Trudeau lifting the moratorium on Haitian refugees as making it possible for the United States to do the same, right? Saying that if Canada can do this and perfect its deportation of Haitian refugees, then we can do it too. But most media reporting in Canada reported it as if though Haitian refugees were fleeing from the United States because of Trump, and were fleeing into Canada, and ostensibly the narrative is that they were going to be safe in Canada, right? That Canada is embracing these Haitian refugees. And of course, that's not the case, as many of them continue to live in military tents that are surrounded by police officials. The other thing that we don't often talk about in Canada, particularly in this, I keep wanting to say post-Trump, it's very, very Trump, we're still very much in the Trump era, is the Safe Third Country Agreement. And the Safe Third Country Agreement was put in place in 2004, also by the previous Liberal government, and it's essentially Canada's border wall. You know, Trump is hyping up the US-Mexico border wall in order to deter asylum seekers and migrants from coming into the United States. Most Canadians are, you know, rightfully outraged about this border wall, but very few of us know that we have our own border wall, the Safe Third Country Agreement, which since its implementation in 2004 has actually disallowed approximately 40% of refugees from even making a claim in Canada. And that has resulted in people being forced to cross irregularly. So when you hear stories about people who are crossing the Manitoba border, the Quebec border, the BC border, the Alberta border, and all the narratives about how they're crossing, quote unquote, illegally, is because the law actually says, Safe Third Country Agreement actually says, that if you cross through the United States, with some minor exceptions, through a regular port of entry, you will not be allowed to make a claim. But if you cross irregularly, you will be allowed to make a claim. So we have a law that actually incentivizes people to cross irregularly, which is why people are dying at the border, which is why people are dying of frostbite. Last week, we got a call in BC from a man, well, from the hospital, who had just admitted a man from Afghanistan who had collapsed crossing the BC-Washington border. He was taken into Canadian Border Services Agency custody. They released him because he was still unconscious, and he is currently on life support in a hospital in British Columbia. He is on life support because these irregular crossings, not just the ones that we hear about in the Mediterranean and in Europe, but the same kind of precarious, dangerous crossings are the ones that are making the lives of migrants and refugees incredibly vulnerable on our border. And the thing that is particularly egregious about the fact that this man is currently on life support in BC at a hospital in Surrey is that the finance department of the hospital is now trying to collect bills against an unconscious man for not being a legal resident of Canada because he cannot yet make a refugee claim because he is unconscious. Right? And so this is just one of many, many, many stories about the ways in which our immigration policy and also our public services are working every day against the interests of undocumented people, of refugees, and of migrants. And, you know, I want to give one more example in talking about what's happening around permanent residency, right? Why permanent residency is being eroded. Actually, before I do that, I want to just, because I was talking about Safe Third and this outrage about Trump that we so legitimately garner. Ipsos 2 months ago did a poll, and their poll found that actually 76% of Canadian respondents said that they would likely consider voting for a Canadian candidate with a platform similar to Donald Trump that focuses on stricter immigration controls. And this is shameful, right? And, you know, we can say all the things that we can say about polling and its inaccuracies, but we have to understand the ways in which particularly an anti-immigrant agenda has become a central dog whistle to all politics in this country. Right? And then dealing with this, we can't really move forward a justice platform without taking seriously the ways in which scapegoating is intrinsic to almost every single policy directive in this country. The last story that I want to share about the ways in which, you know, permanent residency is being completely dismantled, what limited permanent residency rights existed, particularly for refugees, is completely being dismantled, is the issue of detention. Canada is one of the few Western countries to practice indefinite detention. And what indefinite detention is a practice by which asylum seekers and refugees can be held in Canadian prisons without charge, without trial, for an indefinite amount of time.
So why are we paying them $10 million
Yeah. Yeah, without charge, without trial, for an indefinite amount of time. There was a case that went to the UN last year of a man who was in detention, a black South African man who was in detention in Canada for 12 years without charge, and he's not an exception, his case just made it to the UN, without charge, in detention for 12 years. And the reason that Canada was detaining him was because they refused to believe his story about who he was. And when the story made it to the UN, a number of South African human rights experts actually confirmed that he was, in fact, a South African apartheid hero from the Soweto uprising who almost 15 years later had fled South Africa for political reasons. And Canada refused to believe that he was an apartheid hero, despite there being iconic photographs of him all across news media from the time of the Soweto uprising, and it held him in prison for 12 years. And so this is Canada's practice of indefinite detention. And another story that I want to share with you about detention is that around the time of the photographs of Alan Kurdi, the Kurdish boy that were circulating in international media, and the stories came out, particularly of Canada's connection to the Kurdi family, right? How the family was actually refused a sponsorship by the Harper government. At that same time, there was actually a deportation taking place in Ontario. And this is the deportation of Gloria Nawa, who was a woman who had fled from Cameroon in 2013. She actually gave birth to a Canadian child in prison in Canada. And her son, Alpha Anawa, spent his entire life in a Canadian prison. From birth until deportation, his entire time in Canada was spent in a Canadian prison. And his first words that he ever spoke were radio check. And radio check, as folks who are familiar with prisons might know, radio check is a word that guards use during shift change. And so radio check were the words that Alpha Anawa, this toddler, heard most frequently. And those were his first words, radio check. And the incarceration of Alpha Anawa, a Canadian toddler, is not an anomaly. Over the past 10 years, over 4,500 minors have been detained. And how Canada justifies this, despite ratifying the International Convention on the Rights of Children, is to say that Canada doesn't actually incarcerate children, but that children are the quote-unquote guests of their parents in detention. And that the choice, this is the fucking logic, right? Is that the choice that parents have, sorry for swearing, or not sorry, apparently it'll make me live longer. That's what the interweb says. The logic of the Canadian government is that we're not detaining the children. The parents have an option to either give up their kids to the child apprehension system or keep their kids in jail. And of course, most parents choose to keep their children next to them, right? And so this is, again, the tip of the iceberg. What I'm sharing in terms of stories is the tip of the iceberg when we're looking at a completely eroding system, particularly when it comes to refugee rights and all the different kinds of pathways that lead to permanent residency. And instead, what we see is this explosion of temporary foreign workers. And these work in tandem. They work in tandem because Canada has actually perfected a model that at the UN is called managed migration. And what the managed migration system is one that actually countries like the US are even turning to, right? So we're always so wary of what's happening in the United States without actually knowing that the United States has often turned to Canada, and other countries have often turned to Canada to look at repressive regimes, right? We know the pass system, for example, the pass system used on reserves was implemented by the South African apartheid regime. Similarly, this model of managed migration is one that other countries want to use. And what the system of managed migration essentially is, turning back to neoliberalism, is basically figuring out a way of ensuring a steady supply of cheap labor, which neoliberalism needs, as we know, and capitalism needs, as we know, while continuing to deport and detain thousands of migrants and refugees and ensuring that citizenship remains racialized, right? So ensuring cheap labor without giving people the rights to permanent residency. That's what managed migration essentially is. And one of the terms that Peter Nyers has coined that I think is quite brilliant is the term deportspora, right? Liberal pundits, multicultural pundits love to talk about the fucking multicultural diaspora, right? How there's a diaspora and we love culture and we love each other's food and all this shit. But really, what Peter Nyers says is a far larger population is the deportspora. Much larger than the diaspora is the deportspora. All the people that are not guaranteed the right to permanent residency. And so turning to migrant workers, which again, as I mentioned, is really at the nexus of understanding neoliberalism and racialization, is so we know capitalism's drive to maximize profit requires a constant search for cheap labor, as well as methods to discipline cheap labor and the workforce that represents cheap labor, right? So both of those. And David McNally writes, quote, "It's not that global business does not want immigrant labor to the West. It simply wants this labor on its own terms, frightened, oppressed, and vulnerable," end quote. And the denial of permanent residency is precisely what makes migrant workers vulnerable, right? When you don't have the rights to permanent residency, it is what ensures legal control by your bosses. And we know that migrant workers are incredibly prone to abuse, often tied to a single employer, having documents being seized. Any assertion of rights can lead to deportation, being paid less than minimum wage, denied labor rights, prevented from accessing social services despite paying into them, and more and more and more, right? We know all of the abuses of the temporary foreign worker program. And in particular, what I want to highlight is the immense subsidy that temporary foreign workers provide to our economy through their labor, but also through their money, right? So 30,000 migrant farm workers in Ontario, for example, it's estimated have contributed $3.4 million into the EI system since the mid-90s because they're required to pay into EI. So they've contributed about $3.4 million into EI premiums, but they're denied any rights to actually claim EI themselves. So they've essentially subsidized our EI system, right? So again, not only through labor, but a particularly punitive legal regime that sanctions this. And so again, migrant workers represent the ideal workforce under neoliberalism, commodified and exploitable, flexible and expendable. And so again, this is the ways in which Canada resolves, again, the kind of tensions between needing to maintain a white Canada, right? It's real that there is an incredible fear of browning Canada. Every time the census comes out, there's always these stories about, oh my God, minorities are now actually going to be the majority, which is also completely racist because it assumes that all people of color are somehow the same, right? Like one homogenous group and are somehow going to all have the same interests. Like, what the hell does that mean? But we see that, right? We see that kind of xenophobic responses to minority statistics and censuses all the time. So there's this reality of needing to shut down the borders, particularly in a post-9/11 climate, the fears around securitization, while at the same time needing a pool of expendable labor. And so that's, again, how migrant workers resolve this contradiction by being in Canada, but never being able to be Canadian, right? That's the crux of the issue. And, I want to also say, particularly about migrant workers, and, this is something that is not controversial in this room, is that this is not a question of employer abuse. This is a state-sanctioned program that makes labor precarity and labor abuse inherent to the system, right? So we can't talk about reforming the system. It is predicated on labor exploitation. And also, this labor exploitation is deeply gendered and sexualized. In a report done by the Philippine Women's Center in BC, who largely work with the live-in caregiver program and workers in the LCP, over 80% of live-in caregivers reported sexual violence, sexual harassment, rape, sexual intimidation, right? Non-consensual acts of touching and more. And again, this is not just about single bad employers. Until recently, live-in caregivers had to live with their employer. That was a requirement of the program. Imagine fucking living with your employer, right? Like, who wants to live with their employer, let alone imagine the abuse if you are a racialized woman of color that does not have full legal status in this country? That is rife, right, for abuse, particularly sexual violence. And so, I think one of the realities now in challenging the temporary foreign worker program is that we've, especially in the progressive movement and union movements, there's been different ways of figuring out how to talk about the temporary foreign worker program and the solutions, right? And especially during an era of austerity, I think it's vital that we not scapegoat migrant workers as stealing jobs or stealing resources and essentially not being entitled because they don't belong, because the idea of not belonging is precisely the logic of the migrant worker program, right? And so when we have a number of major unions who are concerned about abolishing the temporary foreign worker program, because not only is it abusive, but also because they're saying that we have to preserve Canadian jobs for Canadians, we have to think about what that kind of ideology and rhetoric means. We have to remember that it was actually the House of Labor in many provinces that mobilized, for example, against Chinese railway workers, using that same logic, right? The Chinatown riots in Vancouver at the turn of the century, one of the largest race riots in the entire continent, was mobilized through the Knights of Labor, right? So we have to be really careful about the ways in which we're going to be mobilizing against the temporary foreign worker program and not doing it in ways that continues to perpetuate a protectionist logic. Immigrant labor, migrant labor, and undocumented labor, the labor that drives much of our economy, drives down wages not because of migrant workers, but because of state-sanctioned precarity. It is not the migrant workers that are responsible. And cheap immigrant labor is the flip side of outsourced labor. It is insourced labor in sectors such as service, retail, construction, and domestic work that cannot be outsourced. So the way that we fight outsourcing and the way that we fight insourcing is ensuring rights for all workers. And I think that the fight against transnational capitalism cannot be a protectionist response. Protectionism, I would argue, is both ethically unsound, but also strategically makes no sense. Because protectionism maintains a globally segmented labor force for capitalists to exploit. Protectionism does not lift the wage floor for all workers. And so our response must be one that lifts the wage floor for all workers, which in the context of Canadian temporary foreign workers is to say labor rights for all workers and status, permanent residency status for all workers in Canada. And I think it's the same kind of robust internationalist response is what's also needed in our rejection of free trade agreements like NAFTA and free trade agreements like the Canada-China FIPA. We know that Trump opposes NAFTA because it's bad for American workers. Note the kind of parallel and similarities there, right, between some of our unions and Trump, which is not to say some of our unions are Trump, but I think that should give us pause. We know that Trump is fueling a particular xenophobic, protectionist, nationalist, racist response. And Trump has specifically been appealing to American workers by scapegoating immigrant workers. During his campaign, one of his key platforms' website said, quote, "No group has been more economically harmed by decades of illegal immigration than low-income workers, particularly African-American workers," end quote. So we see here that this is the logic of people like Trump, but also the broader logic of racialized neoliberal austerity that pits communities against each other and blames workers for austerity instead of their bosses and the banks. And so we have to be clear, similar to the ways in which we, I would argue, respond to temporary foreign worker programs through an internationalist response, we have to be clear that we oppose NAFTA not because it's bad for Canadian workers, but because it's bad for all workers, including and especially workers in Mexico, and Indigenous communities in Mexico, and Indigenous communities here in Canada. And so I think Trump's jingoism makes it clear that it is even more important. It is vital for us to articulate a political project that is supportive of all workers around the world and that understands our connections as settlers and residents in Canada whose standard of living is entirely contingent on asymmetrical relationships of power between the North and the South. The last thing that I want to say about migrant workers and conversations about immigration is that a lot of these conversations focus on questions of quotas, right? That even the most liberal response is, can we take in more immigrants? Can we take in more refugees? And these kind of moralistic questions about fair treatment, right? Are we treating people well enough? And these framings, I don't think, capture, again, the kind of transnational questions that are so important for us to address. What would it mean to recenter an anti-imperialist, internationalist politics into our questions of immigrant rights and migrant worker rights? We have to understand that we are here because you are there. And that is one of the most profound articulations of immigrant rights movements. We are here because you are there, which is to connect that there has been an entirely destructive history of military occupation, drone warfare, economic devastation, and now climate change. That means that the reality of the global South is one increasingly of displacement, that is the global reality. One person every 6 seconds in the global South is being displaced due to climate change, right? We know that entire island states like Tuvalu are facing submersion in 2 decades, and 25% of those communities have already been displaced, right? So for me, when we reframe questions of immigration to ones that talk about the ways in which we are bound up in global systems of power, it shifts the conversation from benevolence and generosity towards immigrants to ones of solidarity, right? Understanding that we are bound up in these systems and that we are responsible. And one of the stories that I want to share on that is of a number of 2 cousins from Honduras. And you know, people probably are well aware, right? The Canadian economy, particularly when it comes to mining, 75% of the world's mining and exploration companies are Canadian. Canada's mining companies have some of the worst human rights and environmental records all across South and Central America and Africa and Asia, right? That's a cornerstone of our economy is mining extraction, of course, within Canada, but here I'm just talking about globally for a second. And one of the stories I want to share is about 2 brothers. Have people hear about this shitty show called Border Security, which we actually won a campaign against, and it's now off the air, so hopefully you're not watching it. But did people hear about this shitty show? It's kind of like a Fox-style policing show, you know, like that cops show that was on the air for a long time. So this one followed CBSA, right, the Canadian Border Services Agency. And in one story, they basically followed CBSA officers during a raid on a construction company. I'll keep going. And so one of these raids happened on a construction site where undocumented workers were working. And so, you know, these guys were picked up, they were put into detention. We went to visit them in detention. And we asked them, like, what brought you to Canada? And 2 guys were from Honduras, 2 cousins. And they told us that they came to Canada, they tried to make a refugee claim in Canada, they were from Honduras, and they were told, you know, the most common narrative that will get you accepted in Canada is if you say that you were a victim of drug traffickers, right? So the kind of played up stereotype of narco trafficking, drug dealers, etc. They said that they, you know, told the IRB, the Immigration and Refugee Board, that story. They were found not to be credible, because that actually wasn't their reality, and they were facing deportation. They overstayed their deportation order, they became undocumented, and were working in the construction industry. The story about why they actually came to Canada was that their family was involved in resisting the Canadian notorious mining giant Goldcorp. And their family members, including their uncle, had been murdered been murdered by Goldcorp security, right? All these cases that are coming to light about Goldcorp-backed assassinations in Honduras. That was their uncle. And they fled Honduras, coming to Canada, and were told that there is no way Canada is going to accept you if you tell Canada that story. Because Canada is never going to accept a refugee of its own mining giant, right? That's not going to be something that Canada would ever want to set a precedent on. And so, these are the kinds of stories that when we're talking about undocumented people or refugees, it's not just about, the story doesn't start when people cross the border. The story starts when people leave their homes and figuring out how we are all bound up in these cycles that are causing global displacements, that again, when we start to ask those questions, shifts the question from benevolence and a hierarchical relationship of charity to solidarity, right? To understand that we are responsible, oftentimes, for why people are fleeing. And the final issue that I want to take on briefly is this in the 10 minutes I have left, is this very, very, very annoying debate that's bubbled up and keeps coming up, but has particularly bubbled back this past year with everyone's hot take about Trump. And that's this question of, race or class or what really led to the rise of Trump, right? And what I find incredibly frustrating about these hot takes are that, frankly, they're so ignorant about the actual understanding of race, and that they're so ignorant in particular about understanding that race and class are not distinct identities, nor are they discrete categories, but that racism and white supremacy are foundationally constructed through class and productive relationships in the economy. And as leading Black Marxist Cedric Robinson coined it, race and class are structures constituted through racial capitalism. And racial regimes are intrinsic to capitalism. So when we talk about class without or separate from an analysis of race, we're really not actually understanding the ways in which capitalism has come to be formed. When we look at the legacy of slavery, when we look at the legacy of imperialism, when we look at the legacy of conquest. And, I'm going to be a bit of a snob about this, but particularly I think women of color bear the burden of having to educate ourselves in the context of these debates, because everyone's got a hot take about it. And I think we're all doing ourselves a disservice in our movements if we don't actually understand the really foundational work of racial capitalism. We have to contend with and understand the work of Black Marxists in articulating racial capitalism. And so Stuart Hall, I'll just quote briefly, says, quote, "Racial structures cannot be understood adequately outside the framework of quite specific sets of economic relations. Race relations are directly linked with economic processes. Race is the modality in which class is lived, the medium through which class relations are experienced, and the form in which it is appropriated and fought through," end quote. And so, this might just seem like a bunch of academic jargon, and I'm actually not an academic. But I find this really useful because I think in the Trump moment, what we're seeing is a particular dominant analysis continue to play out, which is about how the white working class, right? So even to be able to bracket the working class as the white working class, that the white working class voted for Trump because he promised an economic uplift, right? That it wasn't actually about racism, it was about this economic uplift that Trump promised. And here's the thing, you don't have to be an overt bigot to be comfortable with white supremacy, right? The fact that racialized working class people did not vote for Trump in the same numbers has to tell us something, about race and class. And Bill Fletcher argues it is important not to reduce white working class support for Trump to class fears alone, stating, quote, "This segment of the white population was looking in terror at the erosion of the American dream, but we're doing so through the prism of race," end quote. And I agree with Fletcher, and I think that this newfound obsession with the white working class, I would argue, completely misses the mark, and it reinforces the dominant whiteness of an understanding of the working class as white. The white working class is not a political formation, and I will argue this to anybody who wants to argue this with me. The white working class is not a political formation. It is a sociological construction that operates at the expense of racialized working people. And to place racialized working people in a separate category is a problem. Ivan Drury, who's a longtime white anti-poverty organizer in Vancouver, tweeted, I think, one of the best articulations of this, in the Trump era, in the post-Trump election moment. And he said, quote, "I spend most of my time organizing with poor people, particularly white poor people, and that makes me know that often this is articulated as racism. And we must fight racism by fighting racism. The alienation poor white people articulate as racism is usually a feeling that their class suffering is inappropriately racialized. The apparent belief of many new social democrats that their rage could be made just if it could just be redirected is based on a misdiagnosis. Poor white racists as a social group do not rage at poverty as such. They rage as poverty as inappropriate to the white race. And they appeal to other whites to recognize them as white and uplift them out of their inappropriate poverty. And this is the uplift that Trump provided," end quote. And I think this is a necessary reckoning, right? To at least sit with this articulation, because it informs how we orient ourselves. Henry Giroux, who has a fantastic new book out, writes that we need to wage an anti-fascist struggle that is, quote, "not simply about remaking economic structures, but also about refashioning identities, values, and social relations as part of a democratic project that reconfigures what it means to desire a better and more democratic future." So what would that look like in our current context here in Canada? I think it means that we need multiracial working class movements with Black and brown and feminist leadership, like the Fight for 15, which was birthed in Ontario, not in union halls, but by working class feminists of color like Dina Ladd at the Workers' Action Center, right? That those are the kinds of multiracial working class leadership that we need. And we know that working class feminists of color are brilliantly articulating how the violence of patriarchal rape culture that daily impacts our body is completely connected to the capitalist extraction of land, that are articulating how gender liberation is firmly rooted in dismantling the wage gap, as well as dismantling the police and borders, and who understand that feminism offers a transformative potential by valuing relational work, care work, and emotional labor. And this is what we've always needed, right? It's not some new hot take on the white working class, but a reality, a deep understanding of the reality of the lives of working people. That poverty rates for working racialized families are 3 times higher than non-racialized families. That in itself tells us everything we need to know. And we know that women of color are most likely to be stratified into low-wage work, particularly retail, social services, janitorial, food service, domestic work, nursing, teaching, childcare, all of those. And I should also say that when I mean working class movements, I include that which is typically outside the wage economy. Despite being stigmatized as uncontributing, single mothers are doing the hardest work on this planet. And because reproductive labor has been naturalized as women's unpaid work, it has provided an immense subsidy to capitalism. According to figures by economist Raj Patel, women's unpaid work is estimated at $15 trillion annually, which is more than half the world's entire economic output. And I also, when I say working class, I also recognize and respect Indigenous land defense as work. Indigenous land defense is a rejection of the colonial logic of extraction that is foundational to capitalism. It's a completely racist caricature to reject Indigenous ways of life as quote-unquote primitive. Diverse Indigenous nations are asserting Indigenous laws and relations stemming from their own land-based economies. This includes, for example, the Native Brotherhood of BC, who have been around since 1931, representing Indigenous fishermen and longshore workers in BC. They're most well known for winning a number of cases at the Supreme Court of Canada around fishing rights, so for example, the Calder decision. But what is lesser known about them is that part of their organizing for fishing rights included organizing in fisheries and canneries, advocating for better jobs, higher wages, and policies against employment discrimination at canneries and fisheries for Indigenous peoples. In this way, the Native Brotherhood articulated and organized, and continues to, for Indigenous labor rights within Indigenous sovereigntist movements. And so just as pickets and strikes hamper capital's exploitation of labor and are an affirmation of workers' collective control over our means of production, Indigenous blockades prevent state and capital's expropriation of natural resources by asserting Indigenous jurisdiction. And what I want to suggest is imagining the transformative possibilities of working class solidarity that is not simply about creating alliances between union people or, unions and Indigenous peoples or environmentalists and Indigenous peoples, but actually understanding Indigenous land defense as a form of work and understanding that blockades are picket lines. What would it mean if we understood that blockades are picket lines that we refuse to cross as workers, right? That means that we imagine working class solidarity in a completely different way, And so to conclude, in these times of neoliberalism and white supremacy, we need bold and transformative politics, no shit, that not only weaves a range of articulations, but that also understands the violence of the system is not an aberration, and that these violences are interconnected. Prisons, reservations, borders, sweatshops, pipelines, gentrification, drone warfare are all interrelated systems of exploitation and control. And we must fight these systems together. We must orient ourselves towards freedom because our lives and the future of the planet depends on it. And Howard Zinn, the late, great Howard Zinn, I want to end with a quote by him. And he said, "To be hopeful in bad times is not just foolishly romantic. It is based on the fact that human history is a history not only of cruelty, but also of compassion, sacrifice, courage, and kindness. What we choose to emphasize in this complex history will determine our lives. If we see only the worst, it destroys our capacity to do something. If we remember those times and places, and there are so many, where people have behaved magnificently, this gives us the energy to act, and at least the possibility of sending the spinning top of a world in a different direction. And if we do act, in however small a way, we don't have to wait for some grand utopian future. The future is an infinite succession of presents, and to live now as we think human beings should live, in defiance of all that is bad around us, is itself a marvelous victory." Thank you. Thank you.
All right, so we have about 15 minutes for questions. First of all, I want to thank Harsha for her amazing talk. We have a little gift for you from the Parkland Institute. Also, I wanted to make an announcement. Please join us after the conference for a social at Dewey's on campus. A bunch of people will be walking over there. It's out the front door, and you can find it by following the conference signs. There'll be a cash bar and some snacks provided. But let's move to the questions. Who would like to start? Okay, I'm going to start with this guy here in blue.
Yes, yeah, I enjoyed the presentation, including all the swear words too.
For Scott. For Scott.
My question was, you made kind of a quick reference, and I wouldn't mind if you were able to elaborate on it. You cited there are parallels with Donald Trump bashing on NAFTA because it's bad for American workers, and paralleling with lots of labor leaders saying the same. Also, NAFTA bad because it hurts American workers, and you said that kind of parallel should give us pause. So I'm just kind of wondering if you could elaborate on what exactly you mean. And I suspect, well, I think when Trump is doing it, he's kind of co-opting a lot of that language. So I'm just kind of wondering what can we do from the left, not to let that kind of stuff get co-opted.
You take a couple if it's easier.
Okay. Go ahead.
Thanks. So first of all, I'd like to thank you for pointing out how neoliberalism includes an increase in government spending on things like prison expansion. There are a couple of examples here in Edmonton with the new remand center that was built a few years ago. Instead of being on the inside of the city where people could get to it by public transit, it's now way on the outside of the city. And not only are there many more beds, they can't have in-person visits anymore. They have to go out to friends and family have to go to a visitor center and do an over a video screen phone visit. And that's for folks who are awaiting sentencing or who can't afford bail. That's the remand center. At the Edmonton Institution for Women, which is the federal prison for women in the Prairie region, which includes Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Northwest Territories, and parts of Nunavut. There has been expansion there in terms of overcrowding, but also in terms of a new minimum unit being built outside the fence, ostensibly to increase community engagement and access to the community, but has actually just led to a lot of disruption with people moving back and forth and changing beds. And there's been, just a lot of expansion there around the prison grounds themselves, which then aren't seen as being building new prisons, but it expands. So thank you for pointing that out. And then my question was about for the kids that are held with their parents in indefinite detention. I know for the mother-baby program in the federal prisons here, I'm wondering about how those kids access healthcare, because here in the prisons, the doctors and the nurses won't touch the kids. They won't help the kids at all. You have to have someone in the community who can take the kids out to doctor's appointments because they're not inmates, so they won't provide any healthcare service for them. And if they don't have someone in the city, then they can't have their kids. They have to either go out to family or they're apprehended. So what is the situation, if you know, for folks that are held in indefinite migrant detention who might not have that outside community support?
Oh, okay, your question? Yep, you're the only one.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to thank the organizers and for yourself coming down. This was a very refreshing, frank, and honest and necessary conversation that I think we need to have in the progressive left. And I just want to put out there that I'm aware that there's No One Is Illegal chapters across Canada, I believe. And I would love for you to speak more about that and how folks who may not have as easy access or have not found that access, whatever their reason is, to support the work that is happening in our communities around everything that you've spoken about.
I think there's a hand here. I'm happy to take some more. Do you have a hand? Yeah, right there. Yeah.
I don't know exactly what I want to ask you. I've been crying through most of your speech because so much of what you're saying, we don't know. It's all under the table. And I guess my question is, how can we let people know, and how can we support women like you? You are fucking amazing. Thank you so very much for being here with us today.
Yeah, I'll take those. Oh, there's one there. Yeah, go for it.
About like these aberrations that we all like that popular Canadians might hold due to popular media. Like, how do you counter that? Like, to me, this is like you have to I'm going to sound like an idiot, but you have to re-educate the masses. And how do you do that when you don't control media and you don't control information and the dissemination of information? You know what I mean? Like, every year I come to the Parkland conference, and every year there's more silver hair. I love you people, but like, why are there not young people here? This is a university. We're on campus. Why are there not students attending this? Like, I'm sure there's no shortage of people graduating from the faculty of political science. So I mean, what we really need to think about is does this message die in this room, and how do you propagate this message when you're fighting against? I mean, what Linda was talking about. Money equals power, and power means control of information. So and education. So how do you counter that?
Yeah, thank you. All right, so that was 5 questions. I'll do them quickly because I'd love to hear. We've got some. I'll do it quickly so that there can hopefully be another round. So the question in terms of the mirroring between union and Trump logic, I mean, I actually meant it more specifically around Trump's protectionism with respect to NAFTA as being bad for American workers and the temporary foreign worker program. So union responses to the temporary foreign worker program as protectionist in terms of being bad for Canadian workers, but it extends, that protectionist logic extends to free trade agreements as well. I mean, I think for me, the response is, again, like I was saying, it's not that it is not bad for Canadian workers. Of course it is, in the same way that NAFTA is bad for American workers, but it's to recognize that protectionist responses are not neutral. They're often mobilized in racist ways, intentionally or unintentionally. And it is precisely these protectionist logics, if we go back to, for example, the Knights of Labor, that, again, intentionally, well, in that case, Knights of Labor, it was overt, right, where they marched on the streets in Chinatown. But we have to recognize that there is a trajectory of this kind of protectionist populism that dovetails into racism. And so for me, again, the response is an internationalist response, is that when we oppose free trade, when we oppose temporary foreign worker programs, when we oppose, neoliberal globalization, it's not on the grounds of it being bad for us, it's on the grounds of it being bad for everybody, and particularly recognizing the particular vulnerability of racialized peoples in their communities here or abroad. So for me, there is a difference in those kinds of responses because it gestures to a different kind of political imagination. In terms of the question of, does that help answer your question? Yeah. In terms of the question around detainee kids in detention and access to healthcare, the thing about migrant detainees in detention is that it's actually not, and I'm not saying this in any way to justify the prison industrial complex or carceral logics. But on paper, there are laws that govern provincial prisons and federal prisons separately. Migrant detention is not regulated by anything. People can be held in detention centers, could be held in provincial prisons, could be held in federal prisons. And that's completely arbitrary based on space. And so it's entirely, the rules are then based on the prison that people are in. The question on how to get involved. I mean, there's people here. I live in Vancouver, which is unceded Coast Salish territories. So I know less about what's happening in Edmonton, but if everyone afterwards maybe feels comfortable, you can, I'd welcome a popcorn. People can shout out good work. I mean, I just learned about the good work of BLM in Edmonton. Migrante, yes, Migrante. Any others? Indigenous climate action. Yeah, Ariel holding it down. Thank you. Yeah, so those are, those and others, I assume, in Edmonton, here on these territories. The two kind of related questions about how to spread the word and how do we get more out there. I mean, there's this reality, right, of course, of increased media concentration and corporate media and, Chomsky, manufacturing consent, all that good stuff. And, without going into, in any kind of dogmatic or generalistic way about, social media, the reality is that we do have, at least online, more access to more diverse forms of media, right? And so in terms of getting the word out, like, to me, it's not necessarily surprising that this room isn't full of young people, because I also think young people access information differently. Like, I don't really see young people at panels anymore. And, that's part of how social media is also informing our ability to hold information or not. That's like a whole other thing. But I don't think this is necessarily telling of whether young people are being informed or not, because we also know young people are leading movements for social change, right? Whether that's Idle More or BLM or Occupy and a whole range within. So I don't take this necessarily as a measure. I think we all access different kinds and forms of how we access and disseminate information. But yeah, I mean, the question of how do we keep raising awareness is like it's one for all of us, right? It's figuring out resources. One that's specific to immigration, if people are interested in, is called neverhome.ca. It's a multimedia website that we launched. Now it's a bit dated. It's about a year and a half, 2 years old now. But, the structures are the same, right? Even though the government has changed, the structures are entirely the same. And it's a multimedia website. It actually got 1 million hits on our first day of launch. And it's a multimedia resource. So if you're looking for one, particularly around immigration, that's the one I'd suggest. It has video, it has text, it's in 12 different languages. So, share that one around if you're looking to educate your peers and your community. Neverhome.ca. There's more too, but that might be your first one. Is there more questions or comments? Maybe a few more? Yeah. Yeah. I saw your hand. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I just pulled up Gold Corp's website, and they have a sustainability report from 2016. Mm-hmm. But Gold Corp is traded on at least 2 stock exchanges, Toronto and New York. Mm-hmm. So they, as well as other mining companies that are publicly traded, give the opportunity for individuals, unions, nonprofits, if they can, for shareholder activism, and do it.
Yeah, thank you. And check out, if people are looking for more mining info, check out miningwatch.ca. They've got incredible reports. There's also 2 unprecedented cases going forward in Canadian courts where communities in the global south are suing Canadian mining companies. One is Nevsun, which operates in Eritrea, and the other is, I believe, Barrick Gold. Is it Barrick? Yeah, that's going to court. So, those are unprecedented cases. And they really also challenge, could go into this as well, maybe others can too, but they also really challenge ISDS, right? Investor-state dispute mechanisms that are foundational to free trade. So they're really disrupting a lot there through those court cases. Yeah.
I just want to ask a question about my name is Aaron. I'm a co-founder of Calgary Anti-Fascist Action. We've been out on multiple occasions on the streets of Calgary fighting the Worldwide Coalition Against Islam, the Soldiers of Odin, 3 percenters, et cetera, bigots from the street church. And one of the problems that we have, and we have a diverse amount of people, we are quite white. We do have some racialized people, but we also have a lot of people that are very vulnerable within trans and non-binary. And so when we go out and block, it's difficult for us to explain to people, especially liberal activists, why we have to block up. And I was just wondering why, or what suggestions you have to counter the arguments that a lot of the liberals and reformers use against people using block tactics.
Maybe we can chat later. I'm not going to answer block tactics. If that's okay. Not an offense to the question. It's just, it's not particularly secure either. Yeah, maybe 2 last ones.
Just to go back to the issue of protectionism, I was wondering if protectionism is not the solution, what kind of trade agreements should we aim for? Like what kind of clauses should be in those agreements that would make them acceptable and potentially beneficial for workers?
Okay. Thank you. And the last question in the back, or comment, whichever one.
You started your talk with comparing today's apprehensions for children, babies, to be equated with the 60s scoop and the children in foster care. And you're from Vancouver, I understand. So I just want you to elaborate a little bit more on the statistics. I just dealt with the MCFD in BC. They took my granddaughter when she was 2 weeks old, and we had to fight like hell to get her back, but we did, so yes. But like the lady over there who's been crying through your whole speech, I'm really quite ashamed that I didn't know that this happened in Canada. And like this lady over here, how do we let people know that this happens on a regular basis? Because I don't really believe that the average Canadian wants this to happen, to have babies ripped from their mother's arms. We don't live in that kind of country, right, everybody? Right? So that's why I'm here, out of absolute love for my daughter and my grandchild.
Thank you for sharing that, and I'm really sorry to hear about that. MCFD is awful. MCFD is the Ministry of Child and Family Development in BC, which is the equivalent of OAS, like basically child and family service agencies, the provincial. I mean, and I appreciate that there's a lot of, articulations of shame and not knowing, but, really, I'd encourage people to, we can figure out ways to move through that, right? The system is deliberately created the sense of not knowing, the ignorance is what the system is breeding on. And, one thing that I often think about is the late George Manuel coined the term the fourth world, right? So there's obviously the idea of the fourth world is that it's not a coincidence that there's a fourth world in the so-called first world, that these are deliberate conditions that have been created. And they're also meant to be kept apart. So what can we do to figure out ways to confront the system? We all have a responsibility. I'll just quickly say on child apprehension, for me, my work is at the Downtown Eastside Women's Center. It's the busiest women's center in the country. It's in the poorest postal code, off-reserve postal code in the country. We have approximately 500 members a day that come through our center. All of whom are street involved, all involved in the street economy in different ways. And every single woman that I have worked with has had her kids apprehended. And I've worked there for 12 years. It's something that, I've understood and been able to articulate as something that's horrific. Now that I have a kid, it's unimaginable. The reality of child apprehension is that it is complete 98%, even by all government statistics, 98% of child apprehensions have to do with poverty, have nothing to do with abuse. And that poverty is, of course, disproportionately ones that target Indigenous women in particular. And there's, I could go on. The bureaucracy is awful. If you are a parent, or if you're a kid in the home of a relative, so if a kid has been taken out of a family and then been given to an auntie or a grandma, they get less money to support the child than if a foster parent does, right? So strangers get more money to take care of a kid than keeping a kid within a family, which of course perpetuates the dynamic of Indigenous kids, particularly being pulled out of Indigenous families and being given to white foster parents. There's also, the reality that at least in BC, if you were ever involved with MCFD and you have a child, your child will automatically have an MCFD filed open on them. So they are tracked by the system at birth. And social workers will track that child in the hospital at birth. And then they will take the child, right? So then the mom's labeled at risk and all of these things that label human beings at risk rather than systems that create risk. So, there's a lot that I could go on about MCFD, but, what that system has created is the exact same legacy of residential schools, which is to tear, particularly, not exclusively, but particularly, Indigenous children apart from Indigenous families and nations, and to decimate Indigenous women's lives in particular, right? Like what is rarely talked about when people talk about, for example, substance use on the streets, if you talk to most women, it's a history of sexual violence and child apprehension, right? It's not that being on the street leads to your kids being taken. It's often your kids are taken and you end up on the street. And so there's a particularly colonial logic to MCFD, and there are more kids in state care across this country than ever were in residential schools. And state care is such a fucked up term, right? When you take kids away from their families, there's nothing caring about it. It's the opposite. So that's the short on MCFD. And I know we have to wrap up, but there was a second question on, protectionism. Briefly. I guess I should be specific in saying, when I'm commenting about protectionism, I'm specifically commenting about Canadian protectionism, which again, is Canadian protectionism in a context of asymmetric relations of power globally means something particular. And, there's other kinds of protectionism. For example, El Salvador passed a moratorium on mining. And Canada took El Salvador to court that's saying that kind of protectionism violated ISDS, right? Investor-state arbitration and global free trade. So, and also war. War is the antithesis of protectionism. To be able to cross borders, to violate people's communities and drop drones on them is the opposite of protectionism, right? So I don't mean protectionism in a general way. I think we have to be specific. Indigenous people protecting their rights and their territory is a completely legitimate form of protectionism. So I don't mean protectionism as a, to challenge it as a holy grail. I'm specific when I'm commenting about it in the Canadian context with respect to free trade agreements and temporary foreign worker programs. So I just want to be clear about that. I'm not here to advocate for or against protectionism. I think it's context specific, and we have to analyze power. But in terms of free trade agreement or different kinds of trade arrangements that are not exploitative, I think there are many examples that we could look to. Within Canada, there's a number of trading routes between Indigenous communities, for example. There's an entire, again, I live in the West Coast, there's an entire fishing economy that's based on trade between Indigenous nations. And I think it's important not to minimize that as, something that's parochial. It's vibrant and it's alive. There's trade blocks, across Latin America. Alba has, failed for different reasons, but was alive for a minute. There's also different forms of international solidarity that are not quite trade-based, right? But we can look at at Cuban examples of what trade means when it comes to Cuban relationships with Haiti, for example, or in parts of Northern Africa. And so I think there's many ways of imagining international solidarity and trade and reciprocity that are not exploitative. But yeah, we could talk more because that's like a whole other, but I'd be happy to. Thank you all. Thank you.